hung himself off a bridge. And it was, it actually shook my faith actually for just a little while. You know,
Yes, that's
it was an interesting
that's a
dynamic.
Thank you for bringing that up. Because that's true and that's real and that happens and it's okay. You know, and I think especially people of strong faith, when you go in that wavery place, it's really scary. And going back to the wave, allow it. Allow that space. If you deny it, it'll come back and bite you. I like that a lot, what you said, because we're closed. What goes in has to be let out, but it won't go out unless we let it.
But that's helped me in the ministry, though, by the way, to be more understanding of other people whose faith has been shaken.
Yeah. Right. It's a good perspective. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to read this. I didn't do the first page because I'm kind of cheap, and the first page had a lot of black on it, so I'm missing the first sentence. But basically it was just someone that said, I got the call that a friend was in critical care because of a suicide attempt. That marked the beginning of my endless free fall through grief. That night, my gorgeous friend, whose laughter could light up the darkest room, died in a hospital bed after attempting to take her own life. A shockwave went through our entire community, and as loved ones struggled to understand what had happened, everyone around me kept asking the question, how could something like this happen? That was a question I didn't need to ask, though, because nearly a decade ago, I too had attempted suicide. That's why I like this story, because this is coming from a survivor in both ways. It didn't make the grief any less painful, of course. I still had countless moments of self-blame, confusion, and despair, but it wasn't as incomprehensible as it was to everyone else because it was a struggle I knew too well. But my experience on both sides became a blessing in disguise. When my loved ones asked me how a suicide attempt could happen, I was able to answer. And as I fielded their questions, I saw something beautiful happen. We both could heal and empathize with our friend just a little bit more. I can't speak for every person who has struggled with suicidal thoughts. I've spoken to enough survivors to know there are commonalities in how we felt about the experience. I want to share what those commonalities are in the hopes that if you've survived a loss like this, you might be able to find comfort in hearing from someone who's been there. I'd like to think that if your loved one could reach you now, these are some of the words they would want you to know. Suicide, number one, suicide is more complex than a decision. People who attempt suicide aren't always convinced it's the only option. It's more often they have exhausted their emotional reserves to continue pursuing those options. It is in many ways the ultimate state of burnout. I talked about that a little bit before. This state of burnout doesn't happen overnight either. In order to attempt suicide, a person has to be in the neurological state where they can override their own survival instincts. At that point, it's an acute state, not totally unlike a heart attack or a medical crisis. That really, I mark that. That's huge. I think to conceptualize it like that. A person has to have reached a point where they feel their capacity for emotional pain has outweighed the amount of time they're able to wait for relief. At the same moment when they have access to the means to the end of their life. The thing I often tell loss survivors is that a suicide attempt isn't unlike a freak accident, because a lot of things have to align in a really terrible way for suicide to happen. I don't know. Again, I'm feeling kind of emotional right now, and I'm not sure why, but I feel like it's really important right now in this moment, in this space that we have, that if any of you have carried shame and guilt for a suicide that was close to you, it is time to let it go. You can take the paper, you can come see me afterwards, you can shout it out to the mountains, but this is the day that you put this down. This is the day that it is not yours. You cannot carry it anymore. The very fact that someone can progress that far is a much stronger reflection of the state of mental health in our country. We didn't fail, and neither did you. The system failed. I don't know how I believe about this, but in some ways it's really true, I think, too. Our system almost always requires long periods of waiting, bringing people much closer to that acute state, and stigmatizes care that leads people holding out until the very last minute to get help, if ever at a time when they really can't afford to wait. In other words, time when someone in crisis has to expend the most energy in order to keep themselves alive, to ignore the intrusive thoughts, the impulses, and the outright despair is often the time when they have the very least energy available to do so. Which is all to say, suicide is a tragic outcome of extraordinary circumstances that, in reality, few of us have control over. We're often, okay, that's number one. Number two, we're often very conflicted, coming from a suicidal person's point of view. A lot of loss survivors look at their loved one's suicide and ask me, what if they didn't want this? But it's rarely that simple. It's much more like that they were conflicted, which is why being suicidal is such a confusing state to be in. Imagine a scale being tipped back and forth until one side is finally outweighed by the other. A trigger, a moment of impulsivity, a window of opportunity that disrupts the precious balance that allows us to survive. That back and forth is exhausting and it muddles our judgment. This quote helps to capture the inner conflict. We are not our thoughts, we're the people listening to them. Suicidal thoughts, once they snowball, can become an avalanche that drowns out the part of us that would otherwise choose differently. It's not that we aren't conflicted so much as the suicidal thoughts are so incredibly loud. This is why some of us often unconsciously sabotage our own attempts. We might choose a time or a place when it's possible that will be discovered. We might drop hints about our mental state that are nearly undetectable to others. We might choose a method that isn't reliable. Even for those who meticulously planned and appeared very committed to killing themselves, they are, in a way, sabotaging themselves. The longer we take to plan, the more we leave open the possibility of an intervention or slip-up. We desperately want peace and ease, which is really the only thing we are sure of. We desperately want peace and ease, which is really the only thing we are sure of. A suicide attempt doesn't reflect how we felt about our life, our potential, or about you. At least not as much as it reflects our state of mind in the moment when we attempted. Number 3, we didn't want to hurt you. Personal disclosure, when I attempted suicide, there absolutely were moments when all I could think about were the people I loved. I believe this. When my then boyfriend dropped me off at home that night, I stood motionless in the driveway and tried to memorize every single detail of his face. I really believed in that moment that it would be the last time I saw him. I watched his car until it was completely out of sight. That's the last memory I have of that night. That's clear and distinct. I even staged my attempt to look like an accident because I didn't want the people I loved to believe I had done it on purpose. I didn't want them to blame themselves, and by staging it, I did what little I could in my mind to lessen their suffering. I did know on some level that my death would be painful for the people I loved. I can't articulate how heavily that weighed on my heart. But after a certain point, when you feel like you're burning alive, all you can think of is how to put the fire out as quickly as possible. When I did finally attempt, I was so dissociated and had such severe tunnel vision that much of that evening is entirely blackened out in my mind. I think that's important, to think about that. There is a dissociation sometimes. Suicide attempts are often as much an emotional event as they are a neurological one, which is why we have to pay attention to what our bodies tell us. Don't let it get built up. When I speak to other attempt survivors, many of us share the same feelings. We didn't want to hurt our loved ones, but that tunnel vision and state of acute pain, along with the sense that we're a burden on those we care about, can override our judgment. Number 4, we knew we were loved. A suicide attempt doesn't necessarily mean someone didn't believe they were loved. It doesn't mean your loved one didn't know you cared or believed, they wouldn't get the unconditional acceptance and care that you, without a doubt, had to offer. I wish that love alone could be enough to keep someone here with us. I think it can, actually. But I'm kind of crazy like that. When my friend died, we had 2 memorials. We had to have 2 memorials because of the sheer number of lives they touched. This kind of hit me. They packed an entire lecture hall at the local university. I was just talking about how many people showed up, how many people loved this person, her friend that died by suicide. Packed a whole lecture hall, right, of people that loved him. So I guess in a way, love isn't enough, in that sense. And you're letting it go. If love were enough, we would see much fewer deaths by suicide. And I know, believe me, I do, how painful it is to accept that we can love someone to the moon and back, and that's still not enough to make them stay. If only, if only. But I can tell you what your love did do, if that helps. It makes their time here on earth so much more meaningful. I can also promise you it sustained them in many, many dark moments that they never told you about. It was truly felt that we were capable of, if we truly felt that we were capable of staying for you, we would have. Before my attempt, I wanted nothing more than to get better and be strong enough to stay. But as the walls closed in on me, I stopped believing I could. Your loved one's suicide attempt says nothing about how much you love them, nor how much they loved you. But your grief does. And I think that's where the love piece comes in. That's important, because the pain that you're experiencing in their absence truly speaks volumes to how much you deeply loved and cherished them, and still do. And if your feelings are that powerful, the odds are good that the love between you was too, mutual, cherished, and understood. And the way they died can never change that. Number 5, it's not your fault. I'm not going to pretend I haven't blamed myself for my friend's suicide. I'm also not going to pretend I didn't do that as recently as yesterday. It's easy to fall down the rabbit hole of rumination, wondering what we could have done differently. It's gut-wrenching, but also in some ways comforting, because it deludes us into thinking that we had some kind of control over the outcome. Wouldn't the world feel so much safer if it were possible to save everyone we loved, to spare them from their suffering with the right words, the right decisions, that through sheer force of will we could save everyone, or at the very least the people we can't imagine our lives without? I believed that for a long time, I really did. I've written publicly about mental health and suicide for the last 5 years, and I truly believe that if someone I loved was in trouble, they would know without question they could call me. My sense of safety was shattered when I lost one of my best friends. Even as someone who works in mental health, I miss the signs. It's still an ongoing process for me to fully surrender to the fact that no one, no matter how smart and how loving and how determined they might be, can keep someone alive. That is not on us. And that, just going back to that we cannot carry that. No one in here can carry that. Did you make mistakes? Maybe. You might have said the wrong thing. You might have turned away from them one night without realizing the consequences. You might have underestimated how much pain they were in, but when a pot of water is on the stove, even if you turn up the flame, you aren't responsible for when the water boils. If left on the burner long enough, it's always going to come to a boil. This says our mental health system is supposed to provide a safety net that takes that pot off the burner so that no matter what happens with the flame, it never gets to a fever pitch and boils over. You aren't responsible for that systematic failure, no matter what mistakes you did or didn't make. You were failed too because you were made to feel responsible for your loved one's life, which is much too heavy of a responsibility for any person to carry. You're not a crisis professional. And even if you are, you're not perfect. You are only human. You love them the best way you knew how. And I wish so desperately it had been enough. Every day since that horrible afternoon in January of last year, I found myself wondering, why did they die? And yet I'm still here. This is the one question I still can't answer. To try to reckon with that question is a reminder of how deeply unfair it all is. I don't think anything I can say will change the injustice of losing someone this way. But what I've learned since then is that grief is a powerful teacher. It challenged me again and again to recommit to living a life imbued with meaning. And I think this is important. I have another piece of literature that talks like this, is you can take your grief and you keep on living, and that's how you honor. That's how you honor those that you have known that have died by suicide, is you keep on showing up and living. You give away your heart freely and readily, and you speak truth to power, and most importantly, to let the life I lead be a living dedication to this person I loved so, so much. I've learned to live alongside my grief, to let it transform me as radically as possible. Each moment I find the strength to do what's right, to be brave and relentless in fighting for a more just world, or simply to let myself laugh without feeling self-conscious. I become the living and breathing altar of everything my friends stood for: compassion, courage, joy. I won't pretend to have a good answer for why your loved one is gone. I've looked for the answer myself, and I'm not any closer to finding it than I was before. But I can tell you, both as a survivor of loss and of an attempt, that life is unquestionably precious. I believe that more fiercely than I ever have before. You're still here. And whatever the reason might be, you still have the chance to do something extraordinary with this life. And that's the end of that story. And here's my beautiful book. You're here for a reason. That's all that I really have prepared right now. I wish I would have spent a little more time on it before, but please use the pens and whatever you need to do, and stay here. Don't leave this place carrying a burden that's not yours. Don't do it. There's a pastor here. There's people that love you. I'm available. If you need to talk to somebody, whatever this looks like for you, it's time to leave it here.
A list of resources you were going to talk about?
Yes. Okay. Do you want to?
You don't have time to read the book to us?
You want me to?
Sure. She's a book
It's
reader.
not a very long book, and it's got beautiful pages. You're here for a reason, you certainly are. The world would be different without you by far. If not for your hands and your eyes and your feet, the world like a puzzle would be incomplete. Even the smallest of things that you do blossom and multiply far beyond you. A kindness, for instance, may triple for days or set things in motion in different ways. It travels much farther than you'll ever know, under the treetops, over the snow, till it's wandered and fluttered, that's my favorite, and floated, actually that, and twirled, making things happen all over the world. You're here for a reason. It's totally true. You're part of a world.